Emperor Marcus Aurelius, portrayed in the first Gladiator, was the last ruler under whom Rome truly flourished in every sphere. After his death, the empire entered a period of stagnation that eventually led to a gradual decline. However, Rome had accumulated such a vast reserve of resilience that it managed to survive for several more centuries despite all internal and external challenges. Unlike Ridley Scott's historical fantasy, the true son of Marcus Aurelius Emperor Commodus not only outlived his sister Lucilla, but even uncovered her conspiracy. For her part in the plot, the real Lucilla was exiled to the island of Capri and later killed in 182. Then a decade later, on December 31st, 192, Commodus himself was killed as a result of another conspiracy led by senators. The conspiracy against Commodus was sparked by his complete descent into madness. I discussed this in more detail in my analysis of the legendary First Gladiator, so we won't dwell on these characters any further. In the second Gladiator, an unexpected twist reveals that General Maximus, while his wife was pregnant, had been involved with Lucilla, and that Lucius is, in fact, Maximus's son.
Lucius, you'll be nearly 8 years old.
My son is also nearly 8.
From a historical standpoint, it's clear that the entire storyline involving Lucius is fictional. In many ways, the second film even undermines the narrative of the first. Earlier, Ridley Scott explained to fans that Maximus could not have survived because the plot of the first Gladiator was centered on his quest to avenge his murdered wife and son, and to carry out the dying wish of Marcus Aurelius. After killing Commodus and transferring power to the Senate, Maximus had no further earthly tasks. He ascended to join his beloved family in the afterlife. Surely he wouldn't have simply returned to his villa in Spain, where his cherished wife and son had been crucified, to resume a mundane life in agriculture.
Maximus the farmer. I still have difficulty imagining that.
Yet in the second Gladiator, it turns out that the family wasn't all that beloved after all, and Maximus never truly carried out Marcus Aurelius's will. In fact, it appears that Maximus still had unfinished business in his mortal life. He needed to stay alive to protect Lucius from those who would try to eliminate the rightful heir of Marcus Aurelius. In short, let's agree that the storyline involving Lucilla and her son Lucius contradicts history and defies logic. Instead, let's focus on the storyline of the two emperors Geta and Caracalla, and on their assassin, the character played by Denzel Washington Macrinus, who made an incredible career leap from slave to emperor of Rome. In reality, after Commodus's death on December 31st, 192, a long and complex power struggle ensued. Throughout the year 193, power shifted constantly from one emperor to another, a year that went down in history as the Year of the Five Emperors. The first emperor of 193 was Pertinax, an experienced military commander and senator. However, he immediately made a critical error by attempting to curtail the influence of the Praetorians and cutting their pay. As a result, the Praetorians conspired against him and killed Pertinax. His reign lasted only 3 months. It soon became evident who truly held the reins of power in Rome. In an auction organized by the Praetorians, the imperial title was effectively sold to Didius Julianus, the second emperor of 192. However, it wasn't long before other sources of power in the empire came to light. Provincial armies refused to recognize Didius Julianus, and soon 3 prominent military commanders, Pescennius Niger, Claudius Albinus, and Septimius Severus, rose against him. Septimius Severus, notably the father of the 2 deranged emperors Caracalla and Geta depicted in the film, was the first to reach Rome. He proposed a deal to the Praetorians. Instead of provoking the gods or challenging his superior army, they should surrender Didius in exchange for amnesty for all their crimes. The Praetorians eagerly joined Severus, and Didius was executed. Severus then declared himself emperor and soon launched a war against his rivals, Pescennius Niger and Claudius Albinus, who had also proclaimed themselves emperors. The conflict lasted several years, but Severus ultimately defeated Niger first and then Albinus, conclusively consolidating his power. Septimius Severus reigned for 18 years, and the results of his rule were highly ambiguous. On one hand, he was greatly beloved by the people, and even more so by the soldiers. On the other hand, the Senate was profoundly dissatisfied with him. Ordinary citizens admired him because he decisively abolished the Senate's power, which greatly reduced corruption. This contradicts the idea, as depicted in the Gladiator universe, that all forces of good wish to fulfill Marcus Aurelius's dying wish.
To give power back to the people of Rome and end the corruption that has crippled it.
In real life, the common citizens of Rome had little desire for the authority of a corrupt Senate. However, Severus was driven not so much by a yearning to free Rome from corruption as by the need to settle personal scores. During the turbulent year of the 5 emperors, many senators who had supported his enemies were executed. Severus appointed his longtime friends to key positions, many of whom, like him, hailed from Africa. Unlike the Gladiator universe, by the time of Marcus Aurelius's rule, the entire North African coast along the Mediterranean had long been under Roman control. Thus, Severus's children could not capture Numidia, since Numidia had already been under Roman rule for about 240 years by the film's beginning. Incidentally, in the movie, Macrinus is even shown as a slave serving under Marcus Aurelius during some African campaign.
Do you recognize your father's mark on me? I was in the service of your father's army on this African campaign.
Therefore, according to the film's lore, in the first Gladiator, Marcus Aurelius attempted to conquer Africa but fell short. He then decided that Africa was not worth the effort and would have preferred to march on Germany with General Maximus rather than deal with that cursed land. It wasn't until 20 years later in the second Gladiator that the fictional general Acacius managed to completely conquer the African coast. In real history, by the time of Marcus Aurelius, Africa had long been conquered and was relatively peaceful, although local uprisings did occasionally flare up, especially in the region of Numidia. Local Roman garrisons were deployed to quell these revolts, but there was no major war or campaign led by the emperor himself. Therefore, it remains unclear which African campaign Macrinus served in under Marcus Aurelius. In the film, there is a noticeably dismissive attitude toward Africa. For some reason, the movie suggests that Africa is inhabited solely by uneducated people, or even implies that Africa is not truly part of Rome at all, but rather a land of barbarians. For instance, consider Macrinus's remark that Lucius could never possibly have heard Virgil's poetry in Africa.
The lines you recited, you didn't learn that in Africa, I know that.
The film's events are set chronologically after the reign of Severus, who was the father of Geta and Caracalla. In real life, since Septimius Severus was himself from North Africa, he actively promoted his fellow North Africans to high positions during his rule. In fact, Severus became the first emperor to deliberately blur the distinction between Italy and the provinces, essentially equalizing their status. With his rise, provincial citizens could build careers in the empire on an equal footing with those from Italy. This was a pivotal step in the evolution of the Roman Empire and had a lasting impact on its future development. Previously, Italy enjoyed a special status. Its residents were exempt from certain taxes, such as the land tax, which provincials had to pay. Roman legions were generally not stationed in Italy, as it was regarded as the empire's heart. However, Severus stationed military garrisons in Italy, underscoring that it no longer possessed any exceptional privileges. Another key economic consequence of Severus's reign was the devaluation of the Roman currency. He significantly increased state spending on legionary pay to secure their loyalty. Moreover, he generously financed construction projects and distributed funds to the populace. As imperial revenues could not keep pace with these expenses, the government was forced to seek ways to close the budget deficit. Consequently, Severus was compelled to reduce the silver content in the denarius. Prior to his rule, coins contained roughly 80% silver, but under his reign, this figure dropped to 50%. This meant that while more coins were minted, their intrinsic value diminished. Despite offering short-term benefits, Severus' policies ultimately led to inflation and a decline in confidence in the Roman currency factors that contributed to the economic crisis of the later empire. After the death of Septimius Severus in 211 AD, power in the Roman Empire passed to his two sons, Caracalla and Geta. Incidentally, this presents another inconsistency with the second Gladiator. In the film, the events are set in 200 AD, whereas in reality, Septimius Severus was still ruling at that time. Severus had hoped that his children would rule together, and well aware of the true source of power in Rome, left them parting advice before his death. Live in harmony, enrich the soldiers, and pay no attention to everyone else. However, after Severus's death, a fierce struggle erupted between the brothers over control of the empire. Interestingly, the film hardly hints at this fraternal conflict. Essentially, in the movie, the two brothers are depicted as close companions who spend their time joking and laughing together, until suddenly, Geta splashes wine on both Caracalla and his monkey. This causes Caracalla to lose his temper and plot his brother's murder. The film's portrayal of their enmity is peculiar, even from the perspective of its own lore. Well, from a story standpoint, the movie misses the mark even more. In reality, the open conflict between Caracalla and Geta began immediately after their father's death. They seriously discussed dividing the empire. Caracalla wanted to rule the West, while Geta aimed for the East. Even the imperial palace in Rome was divided between them. The brothers occupied different sections, avoiding each other. Each had his own supporters. Geta was backed by the people and senators, whereas Caracalla enjoyed the support of the army and the Praetorians. A year into this fraternal conflict, Caracalla decided to eliminate his brother and invited him to a reconciliation meeting. When Geta arrived unsuspecting of the trap, he was murdered right before the eyes of their mother, Julia Domna. Following Geta's assassination, a wave of reprisals ensued. Approximately 20,000 of Geta's supporters were executed. Mentioning his name was banned, and his statues and images were destroyed. Caracalla declared that Geta had been plotting a conspiracy, thereby justifying his murder. Their mother, Julia Domna, was forced to feign support for Caracalla to avoid falling victim to the reprisals. In the film, Caracalla comes off as some sort of imbecile, but in reality, he entered history as one of the most ruthless emperors in Rome. The people hated Caracalla for murdering his brother, yet he maintained his power by remembering his father's dying advice. Caracalla doubled the soldiers' pay, but to fund this, he imposed heavy taxes on the populace. His fiscal policies bankrupted many provinces. He saw himself as a new Alexander the Great and demanded the cult of personality. He even ordered persecutions against philosophers and intellectuals who dared to criticize his dictatorship. In 215 AD, Caracalla visited Alexandria in Egypt. The citizens mocked him for killing Geta and for his tyrannical nature. In response, he unleashed a massacre, ordering the Praetorians to annihilate thousands of the city's inhabitants. Historians report that the streets were littered with bodies, and the slaughter lasted several days. This massacre in Alexandria only intensified the public's hatred for Caracalla. Furthermore, unlike the film's depiction of Caracalla lounging in Rome, the real Caracalla longed for recognition as a great military commander. Although he was far from Alexander the Great, he nevertheless led military campaigns. His campaign against Parthia was a major part of his reign. However, despite his efforts, its outcomes were far from successful. The campaign began in 216 AD when Caracalla decided to renew hostilities with Parthia in an effort to consolidate his power and expand the Roman Empire's eastern territories. With an army of 70,000 men, Caracalla crossed the border and advanced eastward, aiming to bring Mesopotamia under complete Roman control. Despite numerous battles and sieges, the campaign faltered. The Roman army encountered fierce resistance from the Parthians, who were well-versed in defending their lands with experienced and well-prepared troops. Following the unsuccessful campaign, Caracalla was forced to negotiate peace with the Parthians by agreeing to pay a tribute of 50 million sesterces, a deal that was seen as a disgrace for Rome, essentially buying peace without securing any real territorial gains. This not only weakened Caracalla's reputation among the Roman people and his soldiers, but also sparked widespread criticism over his failed war. After this campaign, Caracalla was assassinated in a conspiracy orchestrated by Macrinus. Thus ended the tumultuous saga of the brothers Geta and Caracalla, and with it the stability of the Severan dynasty. By the way, regarding Caracalla's little monkey, surprisingly, this moment in the film isn't entirely detached from reality. According to some sources, Caracalla did indeed have a pet monkey. This fact is mentioned in various anecdotal accounts about him. Some sources claim that he kept a tamed monkey at his court and even amused himself by dressing it in human clothes. However, it should be noted that in ancient literature, monkeys were often associated with mockery. So such stories might have been invented by Caracalla's enemies to portray him in a ridiculous light. But Ridley Scott even goes further in the film by having Caracalla appoint his monkey as a consul in the Senate. In reality, Caracalla did not appoint any animal to such a high office, although another emperor did threaten to do so. Over a century before the events of the first Gladiator, Emperor Caligula ruled Rome and was famously obsessed with his horse, Incitatus. Caligula surrounded Incitatus with luxury, having a marble stable built for him, providing a banquet hall, and even bestowing servants upon him. Moreover, Caligula went so far as to make his horse a Roman citizen, then a senator, and later even included him among the candidates for consulship. Unlike in the movie, the consuls were elected rather than appointed. Some historians believe that Caligula might have actually succeeded in making Incitatus a consul had he not been assassinated. However, it's worth noting that there is no unanimous agreement among historians regarding the extent of Caligula's intentions. It is possible that including his horse in the elections was just a way to mock the Roman Senate. The character played by Denzel Washington is the closest to his historical prototype, or rather, the on-screen Macrinus bears at least some resemblance to the real one. The real Macrinus was born around 165 AD in Mauritania, that is, in Africa once again. He was by no means a slave. In Roman history, there is no record of a slave ever becoming emperor. While there were cases of men from humble origins rising to high office, even briefly holding the imperial title, no former slave ever ascended to the throne. Incidentally, the son of a freedman was Pertinax. Pertinax became the first emperor of 193 AD, the so-called Year of the Five Emperors. It is very difficult to understand who Macrinus is in the film. According to the plot, Macrinus buys Lucius for his gladiator school, effectively portraying him as a lanista, an owner of a gladiatorial training school. But in reality, lanistae were not held in high regard in society, and their entry into politics was virtually impossible. I discussed this in my video about Spartacus, where Spartacus's master, Batiatus, aspired to join the Senate. However, Batiatus was not of slave origin, and he was merely striving for a political career. But in Gladiator, the former slave Macrinus even becomes a consul in the Senate, and if it weren't for Lucius' intervention, it is implied that the ex-slave lanista Macrinus might have become emperor. Even in the first Gladiator, as you may recall, the lanista Proximo did not mingle with the upper echelons. Proximo watches his gladiators fight in the Colosseum through a small opening in the wall, a stark contrast to how Macrinus does it. We'll return to the subject of the gladiatorial games later. In reality, Macrinus was the son of a knight. The knights, also known as the equites, ranked just below senators and were among the highest social classes in Rome. Initially, they served as the cavalry in the Roman army, but over time they evolved into wealthy landowners, officials, and entrepreneurs. The real Macrinus was never a lanista. He began his career as a lawyer, handling legal cases, and his talent was recognized during the reign of Septimius Severus. Macrinus subsequently obtained important administrative positions. His moment of glory came under Caracalla, when he was appointed Praetorian Prefect, the commander of the Imperial Guard, one of the most influential offices in the Roman Empire at the time. As you may recall, by then the Severan dynasty had been steadily increasing military pay for decades. The real conspiracy orchestrated by Macrinus against Caracalla occurred in 217. By the time of Caracalla's assassination, the emperor had become extremely unpopular. He had killed his brother Geta, executed thousands of people, imposed harsh taxes on the populace, and even carried out a bloody massacre in Alexandria. But the main reason behind the conspiracy was Caracalla's plan to execute Macrinus himself. According to ancient historians, a letter reached the emperor accusing Macrinus of treason. Although Caracalla had not yet made his final decision, Macrinus realized that his own life was in danger and decided to act preemptively. On April 8, 217 AD, while Caracalla was en route to the temple of the god Luna in Haran, modern-day Turkey, he stopped along the way to relieve himself. At that moment, one of his bodyguards struck him with a dagger, delivering a fatal blow. Caracalla died on the spot, and his killer was immediately dispatched by the Imperial Guard. Although Macrinus did not personally kill Caracalla, he was the mastermind behind the conspiracy. In other words, as in the film, he skillfully wove a web of intrigue, using his position as Praetorian Prefect to eliminate the detested emperor.
That, my friend, is politics.
When Caracalla was killed, Macrinus was the first to approach his body. The assassin tried to flee, but was quickly killed by Caracalla's guards. Initially, no one suspected Macrinus, since the assassin had personal reasons for hating the emperor. Just days earlier, Caracalla had denied him a promotion to centurion. Apparently, Macrinus was able to play on these grievances. After Caracalla's death, the soldiers declared Macrinus the new emperor. In a letter to the Senate, he announced that the army had unanimously proclaimed him ruler, and he promised just governance, ending the repressions, acting in concert with his advisors, and sparing the blood of Roman citizens. Following Caracalla's murder, his mother, Julia Domna, remained a potent political force. She wove intrigues against Macrinus and even attempted to organize an assassination plot with soldiers loyal to her. However, Macrinus decided to eliminate the threat by ordering her to leave the palace in Antioch and live as a private citizen, albeit one with a vast fortune. Stripped of her power, Domna suffered greatly from her fall from grace and soon died of illness. Macrinus began his rule with a series of sensible decisions. He declared an amnesty for all those convicted of insulting the emperor and abolished similar future trials. He also reinstated the previous lower tax rates, which Caracalla had doubled, for matters such as the manumission of slaves and inheritance taxes. However, in 217 AD, a difficult situation arose at the Parthian border. King Artaban invaded Roman territories, and at the Battle of Nisibis, the Roman army was defeated. Consequently, Macrinus was forced to conclude a peace treaty on extremely unfavorable terms, agreeing to pay a vast tribute of 50 million sesterces. Macrinus chose to remain in Antioch in the eastern part of the empire, where he led a relatively quiet life and barely attended to state affairs. His opponents claimed that the emperor spent more time tending to his beard and strolling with his companions than governing the empire. Many saw this as an attempt to emulate the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius, though Macrinus's comparisons to him were met with irony. The soldiers, accustomed to the decisive and energetic Caracalla, grew increasingly irritated by his behavior. Most of all, they were angered by the fact that Macrinus did not follow the advice that Severus had given on his deathbed. Macrinus made a grave error by significantly reducing the soldiers' pay, inciting the fury of the army, especially among the veterans who had been expecting military campaigns and the spoils of war. Many were disappointed that the grand campaign against Parthia promised by Caracalla never materialized. Thus, despite some prudent administrative reforms, Macrinus failed to maintain control over the military. His rule quickly began to crumble, and the soldiers soon rallied behind a new contender for the throne. In May 218, an alleged son of Caracalla appeared. In less than a month, Macrinus, along with a small band of supporters, suffered a crushing defeat. Abandoned by everyone, he attempted to flee to Rome but was captured and sent to Antioch as a prisoner. While in transit, he learned of the death of his grandson. In despair, Macrinus leapt from a wagon, but only managed to break his collarbone. Shortly afterward, a centurion finished him off, and his body was left to rot by the roadside. The real Macrinus ruled for a year. Let's take a separate look at the gladiatorial battles portrayed in the movie. I've already discussed the various gladiatorial classes in my videos about Spartacus and the first Gladiator. In the second Gladiator, we see a grandiose naval battle staged in the Colosseum. Historically, such spectacles were called Navmachia, mock naval battles that recreated famous sea engagements or simply featured gladiatorial combat on water. The first official Navmachia was organized by Julius Caesar in 46 BC, involving 2,000 warriors and 4,000 rowers on an artificial lake near Rome. Subsequent emperors, including Augustus, Claudius, Nero, and Domitian, continued the tradition. Although the Colosseum, also known as the Flavian Amphitheater, was primarily built for gladiatorial games, it is believed that it could indeed be used for Navmachia as well. So, in that sense, the film at least takes a small cue from reality. However, there's a catch. Historical evidence of Navmachia specifically held in the Colosseum is quite limited. The underground channels and aqueduct systems did allow the arena to be flooded. We know for sure that during the inaugural games of the Colosseum, at least one Navmachia was staged. But historians agree that after the Colosseum's subterranean areas were built, comprising a complex network of tunnels, cages, and mechanisms for raising scenery and wild animals, the arena could no longer be filled with water. That development made large-scale Navmachia impossible. Additionally, staging Navmachia was extremely expensive, while more traditional gladiatorial contests and chariot races gained popularity. By the time the film takes place, Navmachia were no longer being held in the Colosseum. And of course, nobody ever used sharks in Navmachia, even if, hypothetically, the Romans had figured out how to transport sharks. There wouldn't have been much point in doing so. This cinematic depiction of underwater carnage is purely for the movie's spectacle. In the murky water of a real Navmachia, the audience wouldn't have seen much anyway. Instead of sharks, the Romans sometimes used crocodiles. Rhinos, however, did indeed appear in arena battles. Pliny the Elder, a first-century writer and naturalist, describes fights involving rhinoceroses. In his Natural History, Pliny writes of Rhino, raised in Rome to fight an elephant, that sharpens its horn on stones before battle and aims for the opponent's belly, knowing it to be vulnerable. Still, such battles typically featured animals fighting each other or animals pitted against gladiators. Gladiators definitely did not ride rhinoceroses into battle, and in any case, shows involving rhinos or elephants were quite rare due to the logistical challenges of transporting these animals. Fights with tigers and lions were much more common, This led, incidentally, to the complete extinction of the European lion during the Roman Republic and early empire. It once roamed the Balkans, Greece, and Asia Minor, but died out by the 1st century AD. Later, the Berber lion population in North Africa was also greatly reduced. In my analysis of the first Gladiator, I explained why nothing good would have happened to Rome, even if a hypothetical Maximinus I had lived during the time of Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. The odds of a happy ending in the second Gladiator are even slimmer than they were in the first. Even in the first film, Lucilla and Lucius managed to surrender power after Maximus's death, despite the fact that they had the support of the Praetorian commander Quintus, the Senate, and an army that was ready to march on Rome by the second day. The soldiers would have followed Maximus to the ends of the earth. Surely they wouldn't have risen against Lucius, the direct heir of Marcus Aurelius and General Maximus. And in any case, it's unclear why anyone would rebel in that scenario. In reality, Septimius Severus only challenged the throne because some random nobody had been installed after an auction by the Praetorians, so Severus took the opportunity to seize power. But here, with all these favorable conditions, if Lucius, with Lucilla still alive, couldn't establish a democracy in Rome, then why would his final speech in the second film convince anyone? Even more puzzling is how he'd prove he isn't the slave Hanno, but rather Lucius, now that Lucilla is dead. He's still a slave who just killed a consul in front of the Praetorians. If Lucilla and Lucius, with their seemingly perfect legitimacy, couldn't implement democracy when they had the chance, it's even less likely that the slave Hanno would succeed under far worse conditions. I guess we'll find out in Gladiator 3. Thank you for watching the video to the end. I hope you had a good time. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You'll discover plenty of other captivating videos waiting for you there.